So after we had some practice with blending and with values and studying some different values and what the pencils can do, we kind of dove into using the same idea, the same methods and approach, and we used a light source from the center, drew a circle of apples, and how that center light source would affect the shadow and the values on each one of the apples. So what we started out doing was getting what we called the egg. So paying attention to how we hold the pencil so that we can get a circle. So that if you're holding your pencil too tight, you're not going to get full range of motion. So however it's comfortable for you to hold that pencil, so that you can really move your full wrist and feel supported by the table as well. Then we're going to get the center vertical and the center horizontal, and also let's get a box in there. So this would be the egg. A little bit of space on the inside, on the outside. Not looking for perfection. Sometimes we do need it, sometimes we don't. Basically, we just want to make sure we can fit it all in the box. Notice that this has a little bit of shadowing because it's kind of a horrific copy, but this edging right here, and it goes up, that would be considered the egg. So everything that we're doing fits inside that egg. That helps you plan. Notice that I did the center vertical and horizontal there, and that the light source goes in the center. All of these lines will be erased. And then you can just go ahead and start drawing your apples. Now these are various circles. They're not really going to look like apples to begin with. You're just putting circles around and getting something like that. And what we did in the class was just started one apple at a time. Let me put the sheet right here so you can kind of see what I'm doing. So notice that there's a lighter value with a little short, with a dark area with a shadow here. And it gets darker and the shadow gets extended as it goes out. It's a nice idea to go out and sunrise and sunset and notice how the shadows play differently with each of the times of day. That's why artists love those times of day, especially evening. It's so much fun. Just to kind of see how the light moving across the land affects how you want to render it and what you see. I went in a little bit dark. I might not recommend that. Plus it started with a 4B. I wouldn't recommend that either. It just happened to be in my hand. So if you're still deciding what pencils you tend to gravitate towards, start with a B. Especially if you're heavy-handed, you don't want to start with something that's not as soft as a 4B, because that's going to get a lot of graphite off in the beginning and you're going to spend your time erasing more than you are drawing. So what I'd recommend is try this exercise with the apples and try different pencils as you're going through. And if you really want to challenge yourself, go ahead and set up your own still life and try this from life. Now, you're not going to have that edge like it did on the photograph here, but just create an egg that you decide that you're going to stay in, and then study your still life if you're drawing from life, and stay inside that box. If you need to adjust it, then just start with center line here, center line there, and your general circle or the outline of what you're doing, and use extreme light so you get some nice variation in the values. You want something pretty dark near the center so that you can practice going out and getting lighter as you go out, but also you want to play with the values in here too. So it's a good exercise. This, and going back to the spheres, if this seems overwhelming, just go back to the spheres and keep bouncing back until you build your confidence with each step that we take. All of these are skill building and repetition and practice, practice, practice. Very helpful. Happy drawing. So here we have a bucket with texture, so we can play with value in a different way. We can use cross-hatching and all sorts of fun stuff. But first we need to get the bucket on there. So here I'm using the pencil just to get some measurements. Kind of comparing, you can draw it the same size so the pencil actually becomes the measuring tool. You can start with the square part of the bucket in the bottom. Here I'm starting with the oval. It's wherever you're more comfortable. In the class I started with the square, and here I just happen to start with the oval. So here I'm rechecking the straight lines, and I'm just kind of eyeballing where the center horizontal and vertical are going to go. Eventually there'll be a box here, so we can start using negative space. Now that's the white space behind the object, or the dark space. Here it just happens to be the light space. During class I filled in the negative space so you can kind of see how that pushes forward, so you can see the angles. This bucket has some really weird edges on it, so one is kind of off kilter and really sloping in, you can see on the right hand side, and the other side is a little bit more average for a bucket. You can see some of the negative space. It's almost like a triangle in between the edge of the bucket and the line that you're drawing. We use these a lot to determine an angle. I call it guesstimating. You can use rulers and that left brain thinking. I tend to use guesstimation quite a bit. But this is something you can use out in nature. If you go draw at the park sometime, you might not have a ruler with you, and you just kind of have to eyeball things. So I'm just giving you tools to use on the road, on the fly, whenever you need. So I'm going to let this part of the video just kind of play out a little bit, and please feel free to use any one of these tools at any point. Negative space is probably one of the biggest tools I use in beginner drawing, so that you can start seeing things and the space that they're in, and using shape and form to get some guidelines to get it on your paper. And there's the negative space. So what we're doing with the lines vertical and horizontal are just finding center and trying to plot out the straightness or the not so straightness of each one of the lines. In this next part, we're going to get these the straps around the barrels, and they're not following the edge of the barrel because it's an old rickety barrel. So we're using the grid lines to get angles and a visual compared to the straight line of the center points according to our reference photo, which are kind of like these wonky, almost rounded straps. So do your best. You don't need to get it perfectly. Just use your tools. Go back and put in your center lines whenever you need to, whenever you think it's a little off, or turn it upside down and see if you think anything needs to be different or if you're right on track. So now that we've got some value in there, let's just check our drawing and check different areas so we can see why the value is important in certain places. Maybe switch how you're using the pencil so that you can get a different texture, but also play around with the pressure that you're using. So turning it upside down very often is something that I do, just so you see a different perspective. Sometimes we look at something so long, it all just kind of blends together. So we do that a lot in class and a little bit more in this video too. If it bothers you, just turn your screen right side up. No big deal. But try it on your own when you're drawing too. So I'm going to continue just kind of playing around with different textures and getting a lot of the drawing in that I actually see. In the end, I'll play a little bit. These little lines that I'm putting in are perspective lines. So you notice they go in towards my hand on the left hand side. They get a little straight, like going straight back as they get to the center of the bucket, and then they head towards the opposite end of the bucket on the right side. These are perspective lines. It's a little advanced for this beginner one drawing workshop, but it's so minute. But it does help, and it kind of gives you a moment to notice that lines really do matter. So I'm going to continue adding some shadowing, some values. It may get a little dark, but that's okay. I'm going to just kind of play around and see what I like. It will definitely get off track from the original, and that's all right too, because what I really would want you to focus on is how you're using your pencil, how you're using the tools as far as like the center line, horizontal and vertical, and if they're helping you. If they're not, let's talk about it in class. And really focus in on your use of pencils. Is the 6B too much for you? Maybe you only need right now to work with one pencil. The B, maybe you're a little bit heavy-handed. It's really important to know that in the beginning so you can use the right tools for where you're starting. If you tend to be a little bit light-handed, so you might want to start with the 2B and have the 4B ready and only zoom in on the 6B when you're trying to put in some shadows. So I'll continue to play, and you'll see some narration when I do some final finishing touches on this fun project. So do as many buckets as you want, and we'll meet next week for the other lesson. And the more practice you can get with values, with zigzags and cross-hatching, just like in the ebook I sent out, the better you're going to kind of get to know what works for you and what you don't like. Don't forget to lift here and there. You can use the eraser. I'd rather you didn't use the blender on this, just so you get some practice with just the pencils, to know what you can get from your pencils. So have a little fun, play lots. So here I'm just adding a little bit of texture using the 6B. So I've already got a lot of value, and I decided I kind of want to make this a gray bucket. I've gone way off of the original photograph as a reference, and I just wanted to play a little bit. So I made sure my pencils are sharpened, and I'm just kind of cutting in around some of the lines between the boards and adding some texture and some like weathered lines. I wouldn't recommend doing the 6B for the whole thing, because your whole bucket will look black, but I already have so much value in it already. I wanted to do some cross-hatching and some detail lining. Parts of this, what I'm showing you, is a way to sculpt the outside of your bucket. So the edges of the exterior on the right side of the bucket needed a little shaping, and so I just kind of cut in there. In a minute I'll show you the how you can shadow the bottom of the bucket and bring some shape into there as well. These metal rings along in here, well, they kind of stand out a little bit, so you can add some interest to the bucket in between, and then exaggerate the shadow with some more dark lines. Just have fun with it. Just kind of see what brings out the parts that you really enjoy. Like maybe you like shadow work, maybe you want to bring in some dark values. The 6B, the 4B, and the 3B will do a really nice job of bringing in some values. And don't forget, you've got the eraser, so you can go back in and lift it. So let's just add some shadow, and don't forget to pay attention to how far out the shadow will go. So earlier we did the apple and the light radiating from the center of a group of apples in a circle. So the shadow is going to extend out farther in some areas, and for the bucket it's a tall object, so it might not go as far out as you would think as they did with the apples. This kind of looks like the lighting is directly down but coming from the left of the bucket, because it's got more shadow on the exterior right of the bucket. So just go through and add some different areas. In here, I just decided to kind of exaggerate the boards at the bottom because it does kind of look like a rickety old bucket, and maybe the boards got a little warped. So you can bring the shadow, the value of the shadow, up into the bottom and just kind of round out a little bit of the edges here and there. I noticed that I was paying so much attention, having a blast on the right side of the bucket, that the left side just looked completely soft and blended, and we had talked about this earlier. So you can just go through and add some